Today, we shall introduce ourselves to the subject called environment and ecology. And after that introduction, we'll also look at some of the foundational concepts related to environment and ecology. And while discussing these foundational aspects of environment and ecology, please keep in mind that you have to pay a keen attention such that you can know how it is emerging as a very fluid, agile, and dynamic subject. This I am saying because whenever I have interacted with any of the aspirant, particularly with regard to this subject, environment and ecology, they would always say that each and every concept that they have studied in environment and ecology is more or less the same. That means they think that it is the same thing which has been told and retold, however using a different nomenclature. So what they try to do is they try to mechanically memorize these in fact very agile, fluid and dynamic concepts, whereby they miss the crux of the subject, why they are actually studying this, and as a policy maker, what is the role that environment is going to play in their career towards serving the public interest. If you look at the question paper, we observe that environment and ecology has assumed utmost significance both from the perspective of preliminary question paper and also from the perspective of main examination, which clearly tells you how significant this subject is, not only for us to get included in the merit list, but also to ensure that we are surviving on this planet. There is one more thing. Keeping in view whatever that has been defined in this syllabus for this particular subject and whatever that has been asked in the preliminary examination, for that matter even the main examination, I think we can divide this entire syllabus into three aspects which are interconnected aspects, which of course evolves from the portion of theory. Based on this theory, we also have questions from certain particular habitats, and then application of that particular theory into some of the very pressing environmental and ecological problems or issues. Questions are from these three aspects. So what we will try to do is, we will try to study theory first, then we will try to look at, with the help of theory, how a particular system functions, ecosystem or habitat or whatever that the structure that evolves, how it functions. And number three, we will also look at, from the examination perspective, what sort of application these have in our day-to-day practical life. There is one more very important aspect. As we have to know the content of the subject, as we would generally do with respect to any other particular subject, in what context we have to look at this particular subject. What are we trying to really learn, and what is the context which is forcing us to learn all this? So if you look at the broader context in which ecology and environment has evolved, we can have a picture which takes its applicability to such a macro level, where it considers the entire globe, or you can also have your own context with respect to your own nation. if I have to consider this context of taking into consideration the entire globe, the environmentalists and ecologists have been working relentlessly to come out with some of the evolving issues pertaining to these two areas. However, whatever that required steam and required weight which has to be put for this particular discipline probably has increased exponentially since 1960. In 1960, there was publication of this particular book called Silent Springs. Silent Springs. It is authored by Rachel Carson, in which she forcefully presents her argument saying that we are obliged to endure. We are obliged to endure what? She says that whenever we consider the life history of entire earth, we know that it goes back to at least 4.5 billion years ago. That means, as you might have studied either in history or in geography, what is called as geological time scale, and if we put the entire life history of earth in geological time scale, she presents this particular argument. She says that in its entire life, more or less, everything was modified, whether it is organic life or inorganic material, modified, influenced, controlled and regulated by nature. And this process of modification, regulation, control, whatever that you call as a process, used to take millions of years to have the conditions which prevail again for few more millions of years with more or less some sort of stability. However, she says that there emerged a particular time in this geological time scale where within this Holocene we have what is called as Anthropocene, and this Anthropocene, which occupies very minutest portion of the entire geological time scale, is modifying the nature, is influencing the nature in such a way that it is emerging to be counterproductive first, and then it is also emerging to lethally take away whatever is there, whatever has been evolved for millions of years. That means the processes that nature would continue by taking into consideration so many millions of years are being carried upon by the mankind, where these processes are getting paced up, clearly which goes against the nature according to her. She quotes an example here. For example, in nuclear power plants or in the production of nuclear weapons, the usage of this material called strontium-90 as a radioactive material, we know, and strontium-90 has been released into the atmosphere from these nuclear plants. And as we know that the half-life of this particular radioactive material is prolonged, it was reaching not only the inorganic material and settles there, it was also being observed that it has reached many of the organisms. Secondly, she also quotes another example. We are using pesticides, fungicides so inexorbitantly that they are altering the processes that nature would generally carry on for a prolonged period of time, whereby they are emerging to be counterproductive. There is an event in 78. There was an oil spillage. The entire French coast covering this prefecture called Britannia or Britannia was adversely affected with this oil spillage, and almost entire fish species that would exist there, that being a very important ecosystem in the form of shallow coastal sea, which is generally home for very rich marine biodiversity. It spread to almost more than 300 kilometers. The life across this particular coast has been taken away. English Channel was also polluted. North Sea was also polluted. The extent was so large. This is the second very important event which got the focus from the entire globe. There is third thing. These Nordic countries, particularly Norway, Sweden and Finland, are made up of many lakes. There are inland lakes, there are coastal lakes, there are estuaries, there are lagoons. Thousands of such lakes would be found, and they are home to rich diversity, not just biodiversity, diversity itself. However, given the fact that this industrial revolution induced necessity to produce more and more food, forced us to use what is called as pesticides and fungicides. For example, mercury was used as fungicide, and as you know, mercury cannot be decomposed organically. It would remain, and it would alter what is called as the pH of that material where it is lying, and because of which the lakes have got acidified, and which has led to catastrophic impact on much of biodiversity in particularly Sweden. And as we know that whatever the administrative boundaries that we have are those which are created by us for our own cultural requirements or political requirements or social requirements, by nature they are drawn for our practical purposes. However, nature doesn't have such distinction. This impact could be felt cross-border. Russia, which borders these countries, Nordic countries, was also facing the heat. So these issues, which took a global shape, have forced us to think about environment as a very significant and important aspect of human existence itself. Of course, the Chernobyl incident, the Union Carbide incident in Bhopal, these events too, have shaped and reshaped our thinking about environment and ecology on a global scale. This is the context in which the significance to environment and ecology has evolved. There is also a present context that we must remember. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic provides the most significant present context. It has been seen as an ecological issue. And as you know, its impact is profound. For almost 1.5 years now, we are seeing this profound impact not only in terms of loss of life, but also in terms of various other cascading impacts that it could impose. Given the IPCC 6th Working Committee report, it provides us another context in which environment and ecology is so important, unlike in the past. Third, if you take into consideration the pandemic itself, we know that the pandemic during its second wave in India particularly was more from rural areas. And on a global scale, 30% of the cases were from India. Not only the cases, but also the morbidity was to the tune of 30% from India, if you take into consideration the entire global deaths. And out of these cases and deaths, 52% and 53% respectively were from rural areas. And this must be understood from one more very important fact. Almost 73% deficiency of medical personnel has been pointed out by Medical and Health Department at the center. It is in this context we have to note these points. That means what? If there is any ecological problem, its impact would be profound and profoundly deep, and its cascading effect can also be understood. As UNICEF was pointing out, the problem of stunting is going to be seen in number of people, which is double the number than whatever that we had previously in 2018 before the pandemic, or 2019. Similarly, World Bank has pointed out that acute poverty in India doubled. Acute poverty in the world has doubled since the arrival of the pandemic. We have seen the migrant crisis. So United Nations says that whenever such crisis emerges and whenever there is a cascading effect of such crisis in all these dimensions, poor are going to be impacted brutally. You see how an ecological issue can become an issue of an enormous scale. It is in this context this subject is important. You can also look at some other contexts which have happened in the recent past. We know that India has faced worst of its kind locust attack recently. We know that it is because of the drastic transformation in the temperatures which have recorded during that particular part of the period, because of which there was a large swarm of these locusts which have come into India. And more brutal thing is, this entire swarm which might contain 40 million insects, if I take into consideration a square kilometer area of these locusts, were all immature. That means what? They have a high longevity. For 2 months they can stay now. And at the same time, they can reproduce. The impact would be much more dangerous than what we could imagine. And in order to solve this, we know that we have used the drone technology to fire the pesticides, which again would add to few more other ecological problems. This is how the cascading impact would emerge. And we know that this locust situation has been taken up by India in order to promote what is called as pesticide diplomacy, locust diplomacy with Afghanistan, with Pakistan and with Iran. And one of the political thinkers was also saying that it has contributed to the background dialogue that India has held with Pakistan in order to reach a settlement on these cross-border firings. So my entire point is this: the context in which the significance to this subject called environment and ecology emerges is so vast and huge. Hence, it's significant for the examination. It's also significant for you to know as a future policy maker. Given this context, we shall now look at some of the very foundational terminology which takes us to the dynamic, fluid and agile understanding which is required in this particular subject. So the first important term that we have to refer and define is environment itself. We know that environment is referred to as a sum of what is called as the biotic component, abiotic component, and the influences that they can have, and also events that might emerge based on these. It's a collection of all these. Whereas if you look at what is called as ecology, if I have to take an analogy here, we know that we study what is called as economics. Economics is what? Household management. Household management as a separate subject is required for us because we know that resources are limited. However, our wants and our needs are insatiable, which takes us to the conclusion that according to this discipline, there are wants and needs which are unlimited. So limited resources and unlimited wants, they would have an interaction. Household management hence is required for us such that whatever the limited resources that we have can be utilized for much of the wants or needs that we have. This is where we study what is called as economics, such that there is rational utilization and rational decisions pertaining to the resources, such that their utilization is most efficient, optimally efficient. Similarly, ecology is all about what is called as study of household. Logi means study, Icos means household. So it is all about the study of household. Household again includes all these. Household again includes all these. What is that? The biotic component and the abiotic component. What is biotic component? The one which has life. We know that life can be seen in terms of certain characteristics. They can have metabolism. On the basis of this metabolism, They can have their own utilization of energy. On the basis of utilization of this energy, they can grow, they can move. Based on all these, they are also endowed with this characteristic of what is called as reproduction. So all the biotic components have these characteristics, which are defining characteristics of what is called as life. Then you have what is called as abiotic component, which have the components which do not have any kind of life. There might be organic compound or an inorganic compound. These put together are regarded as what is called as household. Now comes the question. In environment, we are studying the same household. And in ecology also, we are studying the same household. How come that two are different? What makes them disciplines or subjects which are two different ones? Remember, whenever we study environment, we are studying the biotic component, we are studying the abiotic component and their influences and whatever the events that might occur because of these influences that these two have on what? That means environment is being studied from the perspective of a particular organism. If I consider myself, this entire classroom is one kind of environment. The students who would come here is an addition to that an environment. They are within this environment. Whatever these lights or whatever the chairs or whatever the other paraphernalia that I have is also part of environment. It is from my perspective that it is being looked at. And how it is shaping up, allowing me to exist, to survive. So clearly, environment is all about a particular organism from whose vantage point I am looking at my surroundings. These form entirely the surroundings for a particular organism. Why only organism? If I have to take into consideration any abiotic component, then we cannot define any kind of environment because it doesn't have any life. So for only those which have life, we can have such a consideration. Hence, how an organism is surrounded by various things which occur in and around its existence is what regarded as environment. When it comes to what is called as ecology, you are not considering an individual organism. You are considering all the biotic components, you are considering all the abiotic components and whatever the mutual interaction that they can have, mutual influences that they can have is what in its entirety considered. So in environment, we don't study the entire household as it occurs. What we are studying is how it is influencing a particular organism. So what are its surroundings? So for an organism, its surroundings will be studied under environment. Under ecology, you consider the entire biotic community, entire abiotic community and their interactions. That's how they significantly differ from each other. There might be overlap of concepts. However, in terms of disciplinary understanding, this leads to entirely divergent learning. This is first thing. So we know that within an environment, as it influences a particular organism, it lives. So when I take into consideration the issue of Swedish lakes getting acidified because of which there is loss of lot of organisms take into consideration a particular fish. For that particular fish, the entire abiotic component has got altered, because of which it couldn't survive there. Hence, for this particular organism, it's an environmental problem. The change in the environment has caused this. For ecology, it takes altogether different turn. I was considering thousands of lakes. I am not considering a single organism there. Thousands of lakes which have got affected by this acidification which have got affected by getting polluted by the mercury, because of which the entire system of these lakes have got deteriorated. You see the tremendous difference. So looking at it as an ecological issue is one thing, looking at it as an environmental issue is another thing. So we are leading to a particular conclusion here. What is that? Whatever that we see in terms of biotic component or abiotic component, whatever that its influence is and whatever the events which would emerge because of such influence is clearly telling us that they are not static. They are not static. They are very dynamic. And this dynamism leads to a lot of changes. That means, for an organism, environment is not static. For an organism, environment is dynamic, because of which its influences are also dynamic, because of which the events which would evolve are also dynamic. An organism must hence survive within this dynamism. There is no other choice. This takes us to the next very important foundational concept. It is called range of tolerance. Range of tolerance. As we see in the case of the Swedish lakes, when they have got acidified, there is lot of lives. That means what? That acidification was beyond this range of tolerance. If it were to be within, the fishes wouldn't have died. So the existence, that means the survival, is hence defined by the range of tolerance. If the organism is surviving, it means that the environment is within the range of tolerance. Whenever Pollution Control Bureau comes out with the air quality measures in terms of indexing it, we know that they take into consideration what is called as particulate matter. There is PM 2.5, there is PM 10.0. They take into consideration this particulate matter and how the air is getting impacted by this particular particulate matter. We know that we have minimum and maximum standard. It is within this range we are allowed to function. Whether it is rational or not, it's a different question we shall look at when we get into that particular topic. I am saying that survival is possible if it is lying within the range of tolerance. Whenever it is within the range of tolerance, the organism can find a particular locale for it to exist, to survive. Continuously, it inhabits that particular locality. Unless and until the environment is within the range of tolerance, this cannot occur. If the environment is within the range of tolerance, given its influences, And given the fact that these influences lead up to certain events, the organism will have a particular locality as its inhabited region or area. Then it is called habitat. So once it is within the range of tolerance, we see the emergence of habitat. And what is the use of habitat? It must support its survival. For survival, what is required? Whatever that biological requirements that we have in order to carry on our metabolism, in order to grow, in order to utilize whatever the energy that we have to get. It is in terms of what? It is in terms of your shelter, your food, your water. These are the requirements. These are the requirements which are produced by what? The space that you occupy in terms of habitat. Once you have these conditions fulfilled, which are now the environmental conditions, which have clearly set up a particular habitat for a particular organism, on the basis of this, we see the occurrence of what is called as reproduction. This reproduction is important because it can spread its number. So fundamentally, either for ecology or for environment, the fundamental unit for us to study is organism. Hence we are focusing on organism. This habitat hence provides suitable for conditions for this particular organism to what? To spread itself. It occurs through what? Reproduction. Reproduction can be sexual or asexual. However, it happens only when the habitat is fixed. You look at the Antarctica. You know that it is home to penguins. Penguins are birds, however, we know that they can't fly. And being a polar region, as we have studied in geography, there is 6 months of no solar insolation, and there will be solar insolation for next 6 months. Accordingly, penguins have to adjust themselves. Remember, penguins are those species or those organisms, let me not use the expression species as of now, those organisms which have survived few of the previous mass extinctions that they have occurred on this earth. For millions of years, they are following the pattern that we observe as on today. What is that pattern? Whenever there is solar insolation, they would come out of the underlying sea or underlying ocean through whatever the pores that would be formed or holes that would be formed. They come out in their entirety and they start walking. They walk for few hundreds of kilometers. Sometimes they might perish, yet they would walk. Then how about food? What about food? That's the significance of what is called as habitat. habitat is not only for their survival but also for their adaptation. They have adapted to this surrounding environment in such a way that for this entire period of migration that happens, which is a mass migration, they can remain without food. So they would go to a particular place which had been their place of carrying on this act of reproduction for all these lakhs of years. They would go there. Because of our drastic influence on environment, there is a rapid change in the amount of distance that they have to travel in order to reach that place where they can carry on this reproduction. They have adapted to this point, this kind of massive migration, that too without looking for any requirement of food. They would go there, they would hatch eggs, then the entire female fraternity comes back because they would be hungry. The male fraternity stays there in order to hatch those eggs, and the entire female fraternity again walks back for all that 100 odd kilometers of distance. They would come back and they would try to find their food, otherwise they would perish. You see how the range of tolerance is defining this region as their habitat, and they are surviving, and in turn they are also adapting to the evolving condition. And this entire thing is dependent upon what? The solar insolation. There will be number of windstorms that would occur, which would be freezing. So they have developed a particular trait where they gather together, they accumulate themselves such that they could keep themselves warm, such that the eggs are also not destroyed because of these freezing temperatures. There is a responsibility for the males to carry on this particular function. So the females would go back. That means for that extra period, the males have to look after these eggs. And by the time the chicks would arrive, the female fraternity would have had their food and come back for all these particular distance. By then, the males would be very, very hungry. They would be looking for their food. Now it is so magical that female would find her mate and her chick by making certain peculiar sounds. And the male and the chick would respond to these sounds. They would identify and they fulfill their need of survival in terms of food. See how in terms of food, shelter and water, Antarctica has emerged as a place for penguins. It is hence its habitat. Reproduction is also occurring. They increase their numbers. So whenever a particular group of organisms can interbreed among themselves or have the potential to interbreed among themselves, they create what is called as species. Then what is population? A particular species, in terms of both space and time, that means in terms of habitat over a particular period of time, all those members of a particular species which have inhabited this particular habitat, that is space, For all that particular time period, all those members of species which have inhabited a particular space would constitute what is called as population. Members of such population belonging to different species which live together, wherein one kind of particular biotic component is forming an environment for another kind of species in terms of a biotic component. All these now live together in a particular habitat. If you again take into consideration the same region of Antarctica, we know that penguins are food for what? In the entire food chain, penguins would be food for the seals which lie there. So whenever females would migrate back, they would be attacked by these seals. Where penguins are thriving on the fishes, seals would be thriving on penguins. So they live together in terms of having this entire environment. So the members of different populations which live together in a particular habitat would form what is called as community. And the community defines what is called as habitat type. So there are various features in a particular habitat type that might be in the form of a desert, in the form of a forest, in the form of a wetland, whatever it is. It becomes a habitat type because community is thriving on this particular region. See how, if you observe, the fundamental unit of organism is defining various conceptual components within either environment or ecology. Organism is leading to what? Species. Species is leading to what? Population. Population is leading to what? Community. In terms of space, we know that these would emerge from habitat to a particular habitat type. And various types of habitats would create what? The landscape. And this landscape would create region. Again, everything is defined on the basis of these. Where organism, species and population are based on habitat, community takes us to habitat type, and from habitat type, the community is also defining us landscape and regions, and also then what is called as ecosystem, biome, biosphere or ecosphere. All these definitions which would emerge are based on this fundamental unit of the subject of environment and ecology called organism. We'll stop now. We shall look at few more fundamental concepts based on whatever that we have learned till now in the next class. Thank you.